Our word was good there. I could make promises, but I knew that was violations of what they call the Anti-Deficiency Act. It was breaking the law. Luckily, I was an innovator and I was okay to break the rules. I'd ended up spending about $400 million there. None of it had been allocated yet. The $7 million that had been allocated wasn't in the right pot. So, but it had been drilled into me, you don't break the rules. So I had this moral dilemma. My decision was let the Army die and play by the rules, or just, start improvising and making promises and writing blank checks and get this thing rolling. Mick Simonelli, U.S. Army, 1988 to 2007. Private first class to lieutenant colonel. In for 20 years and 5 seconds. I'm from Providence, Rhode Island. I was born in Providence and I had a pretty good childhood. My first recollection in Providence was I come from an Italian family, so Mick Simonelli. So we lived in a tenement type house where, the grandparents live on the bottom floor, the parents live in the middle, and the kids live on top type of thing. And my name, Mick Simonelli, comes from that arrangement because it was a very Italian family, but I had one Irish grandmother, Grandma Flynn, and she wanted me to know I was Irish. So my real name is Michael Simonelli. But because she wanted me to know I was Irish, she married Hugo Simonelli. My grandfather's from Italy. My other side of the family is Tanuccio, very Italian. And so what you do is you name your firstborn son after an angel or a saint, so Michael Simonelli. But she wanted me to know I was Irish, so she called me Mickey. So one of my first memories, maybe 3, 4 years old, was her fighting with my Italian family in that tenement house, saying, he's gonna be Mickey, he's gonna know he was Irish. And it stuck. So I became Mickey Simonelli. And I always felt bad for her because as I grew older, you can look at me and see I don't look Irish at all. I have strong Italian features, right? Curly hair, olive-colored skin, kind of a larger nose, strong features. Nothing Irish about me, but anyways, I'm Mick now because when I turned about 12, I wanted to be cooler. And I thought Mickey wasn't cool, so I started calling myself Mick. And my childhood was good, though, for the most part. I played sports, all the sports, but my 2 best sports were tennis and martial arts. And the martial arts would help me in the military later on. And probably the only thing that really got me in trouble was I had this, what I call the innovator's DNA. And I didn't know that's what it was then. And I think about 5% of the American population has it. And that's that thing where when everybody else is saying, why do we want to do this? I'm that guy that goes, why not? While everybody's swimming downstream, I tend to be swimming upstream and bumping into them. And so I even did that in school where I would try all kinds of different things. And that would kind of get me in trouble sometimes, as you can imagine. And it did professionally too. And it would shape my professional career, including the Afghanistan National Army assignment. Probably the biggest time I got in trouble for that was I was 16 years old. And I had one of those experimental, I want to test this out, why not? I just repaired my car with some silicone. My muffler had a hole in it, and I got some silicone, and it, it's liquid and it dries up. And I was living in Rhode Island, and Rhode Island's the ocean state, so there's water everywhere, and there was a beach close to my house. And on that beach, I'd seen an old iron tub. It was probably 6 foot, this rusty old tub that had washed ashore on the beach there at Gaspee Point. Probably 6 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, and it had holes in it. And a couple times I walked by and I was like, I bet I got extra silicone from patching my muffler. What if I patched this up? Would it float? So I went and got the silicone and I patched it up. There were some big holes that I had to use cardboard, but I patched up. This is before you had the Flex-It seal guy on, as seen on TV, patching up a boat and showing how to do it. I did it, 45 years ago. And so I tried it out and went back later a couple of hours with my friend. And we checked it out and we tested it and it was holding. It was dried. It looked like it was seaworthy. So we're in Gaspee. It's a bay like this that goes out into the ocean. We're in this bay and we say, let's try it out. So we push it in the water and we jump in it. And it holds, this little 6 foot rusty tub holds water like a champ. Nothing's coming in, no drips, nothing. And we're going, yeah. It starts though drifting out in towards the middle of the bay. And my friend's probably was smarter than me. At about 100 feet out, he hops out and swims to the shore. He says, I'm getting out of here. But I didn't understand tides. I was 16 and stupid. I didn't understand. I was looking at the shoreline and going, oh, look at all those places on the shore that I could drift to. There's no way I'm going to go through that little outlet. There at the end, way over there, out into the Atlantic Ocean, there's no way. But sure enough, my friend's on shore now. I go out and I keep drifting right towards that outlet. Now I find myself in the middle of the bay and I'm going, oh shit, I'm going to go through that outlet. And sure enough, I start drifting. The tide's going out and it takes me out right through the outlet on the way to who knows where, Africa or wherever. And so now I'm too far from the shore to get help. And I'm not a strong swimmer, but I do ask for help. I see there's, way in the distance, there's houses on the side. So I start waving my hands like this, saying, help, help, help. I'm 16. I don't know if anybody sees me or not. So anyways, I go out the outlet and I'm headed out in the Atlantic Ocean. I'm a couple miles out. Luckily, somebody saw me. They called the Coast Guard, called the fire department. They came out and they rescued me. They threw me in the back of their boat. They tied up my boat. My boat was so seaworthy that they could tow it back to shore and it didn't spring any leaks. But it was a big deal. I guess it was a slow news day. This was when there were only 3 news channels. I get to the shore, it's nighttime now because I've been drifting a while. They're there with spotlights. All the media, all 3 news channels, they're doing interviews with the fire department. They do an interview with me. The police are mad. They call my father. The fire department's ticked off. They come over there with their axes and with a vengeance in front of the cameras, they hack up my boat in pieces, right? They want to make sure it never floats again. And my dad comes, he's a patient man, I respected him, but he had to put up with my innovation. He asked me what I learned and, if I'm going to do it again. I said, no, sir. And he leaves me alone, and I'm grateful for that. But that kind of incident, that was probably my worst incident as a kid. It got me famous, infamous at school for a while because I was on the news, and probably more for my stupidity than anything else. They were looking at me going, hey, you gonna sail anywhere today, Simonelli? Where you going, Mick? Things like that. But that was probably my biggest experiment that got me in trouble. And that would be a theme for me. I would be that guy that would ask you why not, or want to test things, or want to try things, just like a different route to go somewhere, and I'd get lost. And people would be like, what happened? You know the route. And I was like, yeah, but I wanted to try going this way and see what happened. And they'd be like, don't be stupid, Mick. Follow the rules. And I was fortunate enough in high school to be good at tennis. And I was good enough at tennis that I could walk on for a tennis scholarship. And so I was able to get a scholarship, Division II, to play tennis. And I did so in Texas, a school called Texas A&I, now Texas A&M Kingsville. And I played pretty well, but I wasn't great. So I also did martial arts. And with the martial arts, I continued that because I was good. Now in Rhode Island, I'd done Kempo karate and kickboxing. Kickboxing was big back then. If you remember, those were the days of Chuck Norris. Bruce Lee had been popular. And I was a mixed martial artist back then before it was cool. And back then it wasn't cool. It was considered something was wrong with you when you switched schools, because people would ask, why didn't you stick with the same school? Why did you do Kempo and kickboxing? And then in Texas, I started Taekwondo. And what I got there in Texas was I linked up with a very good master, a grand master named Choi, Sinil Choi, and he's still there to this day. And that's something I never had, was a good instructor. And he made me really, really good. So as I'm going through college, I'm doing tennis and martial arts. I realized I can't do both. And so I picked one, and I gave up tennis and gave up the scholarship and started doing martial arts full time. At the same point, I had a friend who was in ROTC and was my roommate. I had another friend in ROTC, that's the Reserve Officer Training Camp, and I was like, I'd love to do that. Now, my father had been an MP during the Vietnam War, an enlisted military police person, and so I had a lot of respect for my dad, and I'd heard some of the stories, and I was thinking, oh, man, I'd love to be an MP, but maybe I can even be an officer. And so I went to the ROTC guys, and I chatted with them, and I'd missed the boat. They offered ROTC if I wanted to do an extra year of school, and I was like, I'm not down with that. But they said, there's this thing called Officer Candidate School, where if you get your degree, there's no guarantee, but you could get a direct commission this way. So I put that in my back pocket and continued on with my college, continued on with martial arts. And because I had that great instructor, I truly think it's thanks to Master Choi, I got really good at martial arts. And he wanted us to do tournaments. So I worked for him. Sometimes I trained with him, and I was getting in great shape, 3 to 6 hours a day of training. You can imagine the kind of shape you can get in with that. And so I did the martial arts, and I started doing tournaments. And I was pretty good at that style of tournament fighting. I think it was in 1986 I won the Texas State Black Belt Championship. And because of that, I got an invite to the national championships in Colorado Springs. And I was about to graduate from college too, so there were a lot of good things happening for me. So I went to the national championships, and lo and behold, I didn't win the gold like I did in Texas, but I won the bronze. I placed third. And so I did really good. And that was coming up was going to be the interim Taekwondo in the Olympics. The year before, at that very tournament, they had taken the top 8 candidates and made them the Olympic team. So from my group of people, there was a big debate. Should these guys be included? Should they compete? Should there be, we have a competition, maybe some of these guys should be in the Olympics. I wasn't a part of that because I didn't care. A couple of reasons. I didn't care about the Olympics, and I had kind of had my mindset now on going to OCS. So I went to back to the recruiters and I applied for the OCS, Officer Candidate School, and I got it. And so I left the martial arts competitive sport part behind, was fortunate enough to get accepted at OCS. For OCS, you first had to go to basic training. And then afterwards, if you passed that, which probably most people could, you went to OCS. And if you did that, you were commissioned, and then you went to the officer basic course. Now, I was just a reservist, Josh. I wasn't an active duty guy. And that's all I wanted to be. I pictured myself, you do a drill on the weekend, during the summer you go for a month, and if something bad happens, you deploy. And, I was a patriot, but I wasn't gung-ho. A lot of these guys that will appear on Urban Valor are really tough, gung-ho people. I probably wasn't that person. I was like, I'm happy to be a reservist. And so that's the path I was on. My basic training came up, and I went to Fort Dix, New Jersey for basic training. And for me, different for different people, and I respect that, but for me, basic training was easy. And I think it's probably because of the martial arts. I was in the best shape of my life. Working out 3 to 6 hours, martial arts will make you in darn good shape. So some people show up to basic training out of shape, and they have to get in shape. And for me, it seemed like basic training manages to the lowest common denominator. They have a certain standard level they want to get people to, right? You've got to be able to don your protective mask at this speed. You've got to be able to fire your weapon and hit this many targets. You've got to be able to run the 2 miles in this. And if you achieve that, or you're better, they kind of leave you alone. And if you don't, then they pick on you. So I quickly learned, do what they say, be at the place they want you to, exceed their standards, and they don't mess with you. And so that's kind of what I did at basic training, and it worked for me. They had fighting skills there. They valued the martial arts. Go figure, martial arts, and the Army is martial. So they had Army martial arts, and they had a little competition amongst the platoon, and then amongst the brigade, they would have a tournament because it was fun for the drill sergeants. And I did really well at that because I just finished, training, and I was third in the nationals. In it's kind of a goofy way of fighting Taekwondo, but it's definitely a fighting skill. And so at that tournament, I didn't win it, believe it or not. I placed second, but in the brigade, I came in second in that, and I noticed they kind of started treating. And the reason I lost though wasn't because I probably didn't win; it's because I didn't use their techniques. The Army had specific techniques they wanted you to use, and instinctively I used other things and went a different way. But I noticed they started treating me differently. And then they had another fighting thing called pugil sticks. And that's where it's like a broomstick, like a bow staff, and on both ends it's got pads. And you wear a helmet, and you kind of hit each other, and you can block too. But there was very little blocking in our tournament. It was all pure aggression. And I won that. And then I really noticed they started treating me differently. I was still a lower than low recruit. I wasn't their bud, but they really left me alone. And I noticed they made me platoon guide. And I noticed they kept me as platoon guide of my platoon, where they rotate people out. For me, they just said, you stay platoon guide, Simonelli. The platoon guide's kind of that person that helps the platoon when the drill sergeant's not around, or sometimes they have you help people who are having trouble, or you can march them and things like that. They kept me that. And so I noticed that the martial arts really made basic training easier for me. Even when I graduated basic training, which I did, they made me soldier of the cycle. They said, you're the best soldier in the cycle. And they gave me an Army Achievement Medal. And, Napoleon has a saying, it's amazing what a person will do for a little piece of colored ribbon. And, I was a new soldier and I started feeling that. I was like, wow. Because they told me, man, this is good. A lot of people go do an assignment. You have to go for, a year, 2 years to get that, Simonelli. And you're getting, I was like, hey, I had 2 ribbons now. And so I started feeling that, sense of gratitude and liking ribbons, liking those little pieces of color. I had a gap, so I graduated basic training, but my OCS class didn't start right away. I had a 3-month gap. And so the plan was I had to go back to my reserve unit and do drills as a private. And when my OCS class came up, I would go. And so I did. I went back to my reserve unit as an MP private first class, because I had college, so they made me a private first class. I was lowlier than low there, and I really didn't like it. And this is where I started figuring out, again, my innovation mindset didn't work, because I would see us doing, just in those 3 months, kind of silly things or things that didn't make sense. And I would go, why don't we? And they'd say, shut up, Simonelli, go make us coffee. And, and I learned, so my job mainly for this reserve unit, where I was going to go back as an officer if I passed OCS, they had a slot for me, but I was in private. My main jobs were making coffee and making copies. Back then, they didn't have the copy machines that will collate, staple, flip. You all had to do that by hand. I was that guy. I was pretty good at making copies, but that was my job. That's what they had me do. And I didn't like it. And I started thinking, man, I don't like this. Anyways, then I went to officer candidate school, and I wasn't nearly as good at officer candidate school as I was at basic training. It wasn't just basic skill level. It was difficult, troop leading, small unit tactics, infantry. It used to be infantry officer candidate school. It's held at the infantry school at Fort Benning, and it's given by infantry TAC officers. And it wasn't to the lowest common denominator. It was high standards. And it wasn't we're trying to get everybody to graduate like basic training. It was more like we want to get everybody to quit who doesn't have a heart in it. And more than 50% of my class would be attrited, gone. And so it was tough for me. And I had to learn. And there were some really good soldiers there that I learned from. Guys who had been infantry, ranger, special ops. There was a couple of sergeant first class, former special ops, warfare guys that were in my class. And I thought, they must be crazy to go from being a sergeant first class to go through this crud just to become a second lieutenant. But they explained to me that the career path for them was way better. As a sergeant first class, they might be able to make sergeant major, making this much money. But if they went OCS, they could retire as a major, maybe lieutenant colonel, making this much money. So it kind of made sense. But anyways, I followed these guys. They could have been TAC officers there. They were good. And I thought they were so exceptional. I learned from them and followed them. And in the end, because I did that, I ended up graduating top 20% of the class anyways, because I just copied them and learned from them and really got a lot out of that. We're graduating. And of course, I'm going to get military police because I'm a reservist. I have a slot. I know where I'm going. But most of these guys in my OCS class were active duty. And that's when I learned about this term, needs of the Army. Because what they do with OCS is they place those people based on needs of the Army. And for my class, for active duty, needs of the Army, it didn't affect me. I'm a reservist. I've got a place. But for needs of the Army, when we graduated, it was field artillery and chemical corps. So I watched the Army. This is again where I had this wow moment. I'm young. I'm a little older than some people, but I'm like 22. I had this wow moment where I go, wow, the Army's business processes are messed up, because I watched them take these outstanding snake eaters, former special ops guys who I knew were going to be great infantry leaders and special ops leaders. I've been watching them going, wow, man, they're going to be such an asset to the Army. They took them and they made them field artillery and chemical, regardless of their skill set, and they were disappointed too, regardless of where they wanted to go. And it was because of the needs of the Army. And it was just a lesson for me that the Army's a big bureaucratic monster, and they're going to do what they're going to do. That's something that I would wrestle with later as I got into Army transformation. I got to take on some of those challenges, but it was a lesson for me. So from OCS, I immediately went to Military Police Officer Basic Course. And at MP Officer Basic Course, I don't know if it was something about basic courses that made me good, but I was, again, really, really good. I'd struggled at OCS, but at MP Officer Basic course, just the topics and the cerebral of going to class, and also the fitness levels they required, I was just good. I graduated #1. I was the top of the class at MP Officer Basic course. And again, I probably attribute that to the martial arts, right? It gave me fitness that just most people didn't have. And I think also, though, I learned a lot from those guys at OCS, Small Unit Tactics. And I graduated there, and they had this program called the Commandant's Program. It was an award. And what it was is the commander of the MP school, the general there, had one slot a year that he could give to a reserve officer to make them active duty. They offered that to me, and I was honored to be offered it, and I accepted it immediately because I didn't have anything going on and I was enjoying what I was doing. So I said, sure, I'll be active duty. And so that's how I came on active duty into the military. It wasn't a calling like so many people. It more kind of fell in my lap, but I was grateful for it. And so I accepted immediately. And, you know, I was the needs of the Army for where they'd assigned me as an MP, but it didn't matter to me. I was happy to be an active duty officer, and I knew I would get a platoon, lead a platoon next. Now, this is where my innovation started directly running into the Army's needs and desires. They also offered me a primo course, Ranger School. Along with the Commandant's program, they had 2 Ranger slots. They offered one to somebody else and the other one to me, and they said, here you go, Simonelli. Not only are we putting you on active duty, here's Ranger School for you. I didn't want to go to Ranger School because, I know you have tons of great soldiers and Rangers. I have the utmost respect for them. They are hard as nails. For me, the reason I innovate is to do things cheaper, better, quicker. And Rangers are known for being tough, hard as nail, doing things the hard way, badasses. In fact, Ranger School takes these soldiers through tough, hard as nail, badass scenarios. I had been at Infantry Officer Candidate School, and we were in the same woods training, and I watched the Rangers there at a place called Camp Darby, and I watched them, and they walked around somnambulistic. They didn't give them sleep. They didn't give them any food. They gave them the toughest missions and the hardest times. They did something that we called in the Army embracing the suck. I don't know if you've heard that phrase, but embrace the suck means you just get into the negative. I've got to hump 12 miles with a 70-pound rucksack on my back in the rain. Yeah, hooah! And for me, I'd be that guy going, but there's a truck right there and it's returning, rations. It's going back, it's delivering rations, it's going back empty. Let's hop in that. And so I knew I wouldn't be good at Ranger School, so I turned it down. The deputy commandant counseled me, called me in and said, Simonelli, you don't understand. Lieutenant Simonelli, this is a career-enhancing course. He had a Ranger tab. He's like, you don't turn this down, Simonelli. And I was like, well, sir, but I knew some great guys who wanted it, and I didn't want it. And I was like, well, sir, do I have to go? And he was like, no, you don't have to, but it's highly recommended. So I turned it down. And this is where I started seeing my divergence of, being truly a hardcore snake eater soldier versus I'm a good soldier, but I'm probably not a snake eater type. And not everybody in the Army is, and I wasn't. So I turned that down. I went to my first assignment. I got to lead a platoon. I did well, good enough. I went on to be captain, and captain was my favorite rank. As a captain in the entire, now I would go to Afghanistan as a major, and that would be my toughest assignment, building the Afghan National Army. But as a captain, I enjoyed that rank the most. I got to have 2 company commands, and I got to start dabbling after that in transformation. My first company command, I learned the power of a military police company. I got to command a 1977 Juliet Combat Support Company, and this company had more firepower than an armored infantry unit. I had, 4 platoons, 150 soldiers, 40 vehicles, Mark 19s, M250 cals, and they were good, competent soldiers, 3-person MP teams that were mobile, and we could do a lot. And I commanded in Germany and had a great first sergeant, great NCOs. And so they made my company the ready company. We were the best for a while. We were the best company in Europe. And that means if the flag went up, something happened, they said, you're going to go. And sure enough, while I was commanding, when we were that ready company, Bosnia hit. And there were the war atrocities there. And the U.S. decided we were going to go in and stop that in a peacemaking mission. Because I was an MP, they made me the pointy end of my company, the 127th MP company, the pointy end of the spear. And we were in Bosnia first in December of '95, and I was the commander. And it was a tough mission. But I learned so much there, and learned about, I wasn't green anymore. And it was unfortunate, in Bosnia, we had the first mine casualty, the first non-combat casualty. So one of my guys ran over a TMM-1 anti-tank mine. Another one got run over by a train while guarding it. Our mission was to go in and secure the Sava River that we were going to cross. We were secure the north side on Croatia, my MP company, the south side in Bosnia, secure the roadways, then let the engineer unit come in, build the bridge, and then our mission was to push everybody into Bosnia. And that's what we did. But in that mission, we had to clear over 100 bad guy checkpoints. And we encountered, all kinds of hazards. It was tough, and it was a learning experience for me. So back to the innovation sort of thread that I had, because I'm an innovator, is I learned how to do, and this is from the Army, I'm very grateful for it, a fantastic after-action review. The Army invented this thing called after-action reviews in the 70s, and it's essentially evaluating what you're doing, big missions, small missions, whatever. In the middle of it, at the end, but making yourself better while you're doing it. You say, what are we trying to do? What did we do? What went wrong, right? And how do we change it next time? So we would clear these bad guy checkpoints in Bosnia. We would roll up on them from a covered and concealed position. We would point our weapons at them. We'd get on the megaphone and say, hey, drop your weapons and leave. Vacate. We are Americans. We have the authority to use force. We had a little script we read, and almost always, luckily, they would drop their weapons and leave. Then we would huddle up on that point, collect their weapons, and have an after-action review right there, and learn about what we did right, what we did wrong, where we should have been positioned better. And then by the time we got to the next clearing of a checkpoint, we were doing it better. And it was an amazing learning experience for me, and something I would use in the Army over and over again, and then in the private sector too, because it's a fantastic tool for continuing to get better. So in Bosnia, the first casualty in theater was Specialist Bagash. He was the specialist. He was driving. We're securing both sides of the Sava River. Bagash is on the far side of the Sava River, and for whatever reason, he runs through a mine. His squad runs through a mined area, and he hits, front wheel, left wheel hits an anti-tank mine. While he's over there, he's attached to somebody else, but I'm up on top of a broken bridge with my AM radio, commanding and controlling my guys with my ops sergeant, and Bagash comes over my command net and says, "Brisk broken up, can barely hear him. I hit a mine." And so we immediately get medevac. We get on the medical channel. We're trying to get people to him. We ask him, "Well, what happened? What did you?" And he says, "I hit a TMM-1 anti-tank mine." I'm sitting there going, right, how's he gonna know exactly what kind of mine he hits? When you hit a mine, they explode. I was like, okay, this is his training, because we had mine training. This is training seeping in. He's like, told my ops sergeant who was up there with me, I think, talked to him, said, ask him how he knows it was a TMM-1, but I knew he didn't know it was a TMM-1. He said something like, I'm sitting on top of it and I'm looking out my door at it, and there was an undetonated one right underneath his car with the detonation rod halfway bent, and he was reading it, the nomenclature off the top of it. And I was like, gosh, I said, tell him not to move, because in our training, we were trained, you get out and you go out the back of the vehicle and you follow your tracks out so you can escape the minefield. But in this case, it was one of those, moments where if you make that vehicle move too much, it's going to explode. One of those cartoon moments, where you see where they're teetering on the edge of the thing. He was in that position. And so he waited. We got help there for him. They evacuated. Bagash was amazing because he was the one that was injured, but he was the one that had the wherewithal to continue talking to us until medevac arrived and to be taking instruction. His sergeant was like, and the gunner had concussion. But Bagash, the guy who really got injured, was amazing. And that was the first incident there in the entire region. Gosh, ended up getting, of course, a Purple Heart and a very nice prosthetic. And I believe I saw him in the media jogging with President Clinton. He was one of those type of things. So I think he did all right. I think he's an accountant somewhere out in Indiana or somewhere like that now. So after that first command, I became a second company commander, and this time it was a lot of fun too. Although the 127 MP wasn't so much fun as it was enriching as far as learning how to maneuver a company in combat. The second command was at the Army Dog School. I got to be the commander for the Army Dog School, the detachment. So all the services participate in the dog school at Lackland Air Force Base, and the Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines will all have their schools there. I was the commander there. And for 2 years, I got to train all of the dogs for the U.S. Army and all the dog handlers. And it was a great experience. I love animals. I love dogs. And so I developed a new appreciation for four-legged soldiers. They are fantastic. And in that I learned so much, and I became a dog handler, and I, learned all about what to do and how to deploy dogs, and it was fantastic. And that was my second command. After that, I went into a couple of staff jobs as a captain, and one was a transformation officer job. This is where I actually got to start working in the field of transformation innovation. It wasn't a career field. Like, you couldn't say, my MOS is blank, blank, blank innovation. But there were definitely, the Army wants to transform and innovate. So there were definitely positions, and I got to be in one as a captain. And that was working with the Air Force security forces. So what was going on is the Air Force has their own police force, as you're probably aware. They were the SPs, security police. Their general was a Vietnam veteran, career, tough guy who wanted to make them more combat oriented. He changed them from SPs, security police, to SF, security forces. He created a spot on his staff for an MP because he wanted them to be more MP-like. Not in everything, but he wanted to be more combat-oriented, more air-based defense-oriented. So I was that captain that got to be on the adjunct to the air staff to help them transform. And I loved it. Loved doing those transformation things, and I was in my element because I had that innovation streak. And by now I'd realized at age 29, 30, that that's really where my calling was. That's where I was self-actualized. I wasn't a snake eater, but I clearly was a guy who could, when I asked why not, could I help the organization become better, do things better, faster, cheaper that way? And so I started doing that. And as part of that job, the Air Force had air-based defense security. They had surface-to-air missiles called Stingers, which most people know they're shoulder-fired, two-man teams, and very effective. And so we were looking at how to deploy those. But in that process, we found a better system. It wasn't in existence yet, but myself and the Air Force Master Sergeant I was working with, Yankee, I think he became a Chief Master Sergeant, we helped develop a new prototype called the Slam Ram. Working with Hughes and Raytheon, these contractor companies, more than happy to help us develop it. And what it was, well, first it dwarfed the Stinger's capabilities, at least on paper. Whereas the Stinger had an unclassified arch of about a mile, that means it could shoot things out of the air about a mile away. The Slam Ram had about an unclassified range of about 5 miles. So from 1 to 5 miles, it could shoot, really drastically better. All it was we took two existing things that already existed in the military, the Army and the Air Force. The Humvee, which had been very successful up to that point, still is, and the AMRAAM missile, which had been very successful up to that point, still is. The AMRAAM's an air-to-air missile they use for dogfighting and such. It could shoot down cruisers, etc. All we did is take the AMRAAMs, put them on top of the Humvee, put a slew and Q turret on it, and make it so it could shoot from the ground up. And that was the concept. The Marines loved it. They had an air defense. The Army was a little cold on it, and they were the big kahuna. So the Marines, helped us build a prototype, helped the Air Force build a prototype. So we built a prototype, and the Marines tested it. And lo and behold, it worked miraculously, just like it looked like it would work on paper. It did have a range of 5 times. So it's fantastic. So Yankee and I, Master Sergeant Yankee and I went to the Air Defense School, because we needed their blessings. We needed them to buy into this, and they've been kind of cold. But we thought we were going to go there, and it was going to be high. When they saw the facts, there's going to be high fives and, you know, celebrations, and, you know, they're going to make us honorary air defenders and all that stuff. Just the opposite happened. We did the brief, and it was cold. It was a cold reception, and I'm in the bathroom. After I briefed, I go to the bathroom. You know, I'm at the urinal, and this is the days before you had separators. The Fort Bliss general, the big guy, comes up beside me in the urinal, and he says, right next to me. Protocol in those days, you didn't even really talk to each other at the urinal unless you're buddies, but he comes right up, right next to me, says, Simonelli, I appreciate the you know, the value of the slam ram. It's called the slam ram, and how, you know, what the capabilities it's got. But I've been working on my, he said, but I've been working on my force structure for years. And if this slam ram fucks up my force structure, then I'm gonna break your fucking legs. I remember him, she said it just like that. He swore at me to make emphasis. And then he laughed, and I was just kind of standing there going, wow, what the hell just happened? And I went back to my seat. I talked to Yankee, and we thought about it a while. And what we realized is, and this was a lesson for me in innovation, is he was a status quo guy, and they're everywhere, and I would find them everywhere. And this is a common problem I run into now. Army, private sector, everywhere. He had built up his force structure based on the Stinger missile. He's the big guy in charge, and he has slots justified based on having these teams deployed. Our slam ram was going to reduce his force structure if it were deployed by a magnitude of 1,000%, right? 5 to 1. He was going to greatly reduce his, and he did not want that to happen. He'd fought his whole career, according to him, to get his force structure up, to grow it. His rank was probably tied to the size of the number of people he had, and he did not want anything to change that. Even though the slam ram would save lives, even though the slam ram would, you know, save resources, reduce the number of people that had to be deployed, had so many benefits, he was more concerned about his force structure. And because of that, I would move on from that into my next assignment. We should have been in production with the slam ram in a year. It had prototyped, it had tested well, we could have been in production quickly, but because of the status quo and people fighting, wanting change, like this general, it would take 6, 7 years, a number of other officers carrying this program for it to finally launch. And when it did launch, it was effective, and it was good, and it went throughout the Army, and we sold it to our allies. I think it's been decommissioned now in the US, still allies still using it, but didn't get really nearly the benefit out of it. And that was an eye-opener for me, that a general who was at the top of his game would rather risk lives to have force structure and to keep the status quo. And I hated it. But it was a lesson to me. It didn't stop me from innovating, but it was a lesson. So from there, I said to myself, wow, I'm not a great MP. I really love being an innovator. I've got to target innovation. And so I noticed that the comptrollers, the money managers in the Army, tended to get the innovation functions, or at least the transformation functions. I don't know why, because they controlled the money maybe. So I asked to transfer to be, at that point I could get a functional area. They wanted you to have a secondary area, and I asked to become a comptroller. And I was fortunate enough to get accepted. I went on to become a comptroller, and then luckily I got accepted for this school at Syracuse, which made you a really good comptroller. It was at Syracuse University, it was an MBA program, but they added in, it was taught by military also, and it was owned by the Army, but we had all the services going to it, and it would give you all of the certified defense financial management stuff too. So I left as a certified defense financial manager. And I knew a lot more based on that school, and I became a comptroller, which means I could target transformation jobs. And so I did. And I targeted a transformation job at U.S. Forces Command, controlled all the U.S. forces. The Army was digitizing. They were having digital transformation. And so I got, in 2001, I had the title Transformation Officer. This is 25 years ago, 24 years. Nowadays, there are still private organizations that are transforming digitally. I just finished a 3-year stint with Union of Arab Banks as their digital transformation innovator. Most people don't realize the U.S. military was the first to digitally transform in the world. And what a competitive advantage it gave us. Whereas, the fog of war and having to use analog communications and radios, unit A, this is unit B, where are you? And you're trying to figure out where they are on a map and trying to figure it out. And there's smoke and the fog of war. Digitization gave us the ability to sit in an air-conditioned control room, see where our friendly forces were with accuracy, see where the enemy was, and outmaneuver them. Just a huge competitive advantage. And we started getting that, over 20 years ago. Now, a lot of public corporations are getting into that game or in that game, and they see the value. But the U.S. Army was the first to do that, and I was a small part of that at Forces Command, and that I was the funding guy that would help fill the gaps of that transformation. So as we were digitally transforming, there were gaps with training, with equipment, etc., and I would have to either use existing resources or go to the Pentagon and fight for resources to fix it. So that's how I found myself in the Pentagon on 9/11. I wasn't assigned there. I was actually there trying to get resources for transformation. I was briefing. And at the time I was in the finance section of the Pentagon, which is the section that was hit by the plane. And I was asking for more money and justifying it to the guys up there in the Pentagon. And lo and behold, while I'm briefing, we hear somebody in the background scream, "The Twin Towers have been hit." We're thinking, what the hell does that mean? We have no clue what's going on. Shortly after that, the plane rammed into the side of the Pentagon where I was at. The nose of the plane ended up 100 feet from where I'm at. There's smoke, broken glass, screaming, death. It was an ugly scene, and we still didn't know what was going on. I thought maybe a construction bomb had gone off because it was construction in the Pentagon the wrong way. I actually reached over close to me and I saw a big silver piece of fuselage right where I was at. And I picked it up and I showed it to Colonel Kearns, my boss, who was there with me. And I said, "Sir, look at this." And he said something like, "Holy shit, Mick, we need to help people evacuate and get the hell out of here," because it was a silver piece of the plane, a little memento of the incident. And so we got out of there and we vacated. But one thing about that is there's conspiracy theories that a plane didn't hit there. And a lot of times I think these conspiracy theories are right. But in this case, I would have to tell them, use my personal example, how somebody would have had to set me up by being so close to where the explosion occurred that they took a piece of plane fuselage and shoved it over close to me right after the explosion so that I could pick it up and go, "Hey, a plane just hit." I don't think that happened. I think a plane hit, and I think a piece of it ended up by my feet. And just like most Americans, I was filled with the bloodlust after that. I was pissed off. I was personally involved in that too, and I wanted to do something greater. Most of the people that died, if you look at their MOSs, they were finance specialties, so it came in right there. I was lucky. I only lost my suitcase. We were leaving that day, so our suitcases were over there, but we were okay. Little did I know my future boss, General Eikenberry, who would be the guy to overseeing the Afghan National Army building, was there also. And he was assigned there, and he was actually doing things heroically. He was so close to somebody that he saved him. So I was filled with this bloodlust. And I said, I got to do more. And I was kind of due to do something anyways. And so I volunteered to help with the Afghanistan cause. It's not like I was doing something heroic like Pat Tillman. If you recall who Pat Tillman was, he was that football player, safety, who gave up a multi-million-dollar contract and said, "I want to be a snake eater. I want to be a ranger. Embrace the suck. I want to go in there to Afghanistan and fight." And he went in 2004. And unfortunately, right after I left, he gave his life. But my volunteering, that was he's a man among men, right? He gave up all his cush life and he went. I wasn't like that. It was more, I was already in the military and I was angry, and I had heard that Guantanamo Bay needed a comptroller. Now, Guantanamo Bay is a much cushier way to support Afghanistan. Guantanamo Bay that's where we were keeping all the hardened, terrorists we were capturing. And I pictured myself going there and, the bad guys would be inside the wire and I'd be on the outside and I'd be safe. And I even heard there was a McDonald's on Guantanamo and, maybe I could throw a fishing line in the water every once in a while. So I wasn't, a Pat Tillman type volunteer. I was kind of targeting Guantanamo. But I put my name in the hat to go somewhere. And little did I know that General Eikenberry had been tasked to build the army for Afghanistan, the guy that was in the Pentagon. And he knew about the Army Syracuse program. And apparently they needed a comptroller desperately because they were building an army from scratch. And I had my name in the hat, and he needed a comptroller, and he wanted somebody from Syracuse. And so I got sent to Afghanistan to a place called the Office of Military Cooperation. And their mission was to build an army from scratch. And there were only 9 people strong, counting General Eikenberry and myself. But before I went there, I tried to figure some things out, what was going on. I got a day to go to Central Command. So I went to Central Command, which kind of was overseeing the region, and tried to figure things out. I spent half the day in with the finance people, and they didn't know anything about the mission. And that was scary to me. I was like, well, where's the money coming from? And how are you doing it? The other half, as I started asking questions and figuring it out, I spent with the plans guys, because I found out that it was the plans guys that were controlling the Afghanistan. And so they really knew what was going on, but they weren't money guys. The reason they weren't money guys is because there really was not much money over there. There was a little bit of stopgap funding, I think, of $7 million that they'd sent, which is a pittance to build an army from scratch. And that's all that was there. But I went and I talked to the Central Command guys, and I learned a lot. And they were doing what plans guys do. They were planning the building of this army down to the minute details. They had the number of socks planned per soldier, and how it was going to work. I would later find out that none of that was working on the ground. So I learned something, but what I learned more was that there was really no plan. And so it was working. So then I go to Afghanistan. I show up. I'm assigned there at the embassy, at the U.S. Embassy, and it's a war-torn embassy. It's not an embassy like you might picture, like the one now, or I don't know what the shape of it is now since we abandoned, but there was a brand new embassy built. This was the old war-torn embassy. Had holes in the roof for mortars, had machine gun fire on glass, had a big wall around it. It was guarded by, we were lucky, fortunately, we had a company of Marines there guarding it, but it was every couple of days they would lob rockets and artillery at us, or there'd be some kind of attack on us. It was that kind of an environment because it was the start of the war. I was there from 02 to 03, so I showed up in 02 and immediately tried to figure out what the funding situation is and what my job would be. And what I found was there had been no comptroller there, no money manager, and the stopgap funding wasn't working because the Marine planners, or the CENTCOM planners, who were Marines and Army guys, had sent it to the theater in such a way that it could only be spent the way they wanted it. So if they planned down to a gnat's ass, we're going to spend this much on socks, there's colors of money, that's all you could spend it on. If they said we're going to spend this on vehicles, that's all you could spend it on. Well, the guys trying to build the Army in its fledgling state, the Special Forces guys who were charged, they were the trainers when I showed up, they couldn't use that money. It didn't fit what they needed. They needed very basic things like food, shelter. The Marines, or I call them Marines because they were a Marine Army camp at CENTCOM, had sent it in such a form they couldn't use it. And so right away, I had a moral dilemma. These special operators, and to build the Army, required money that we didn't have. We just didn't have it. All of this money that would flow in, I'd end up spending about $400 million there. None of it had been allocated yet. The $7 million that had been allocated wasn't in the right pot. So our word was good there. I could make promises, but I knew that was violations of what they call the Anti-Deficiency Act. It was breaking the law. I wasn't allowed to do that. I'd been drilled in me from comptroller school. Luckily, I was an innovator and I was okay to break the rules, but it'd been drilled into me, you don't break the rules. So I had this moral dilemma. Do I let the Army, just as a journeyman comptroller, right? I'm not a big shot, I'm a major at this point. Eikenberry, my general, is building the Army, but my decision was let the Army die and play by the rules, or just, start improvising and making promises and writing blank checks and get this thing rolling. And I decided, obviously, to start improvising and writing blank checks and get this thing rolling. And I did it so that I was the only guy that could be blamed. It didn't involve Eikenberry or the chief of staff, so that later on, because I was starting to think I would probably be prosecuted later on, because I was just doing things that just totally illegal. So had the Special Forces guys, by the way, which I really appreciated. They had already started doing it, and I continued it. But they're called, one of their nicknames is Quiet Professionals, and I love the fact that they would just take care of the mission and say, well, it's not, the bureaucracy isn't supporting us, but we got this mission. And it was a true mission. The interim president of Afghanistan, Karzai, had said his #1 priority was to build an army that responded to him. Now that's in the face of no economy, no banking system. They didn't have a currency. Their Afghanistan was done. Over 90% illiteracy rate in the country. No electricity anywhere. All those problems, and the interim president still said, my #1 priority is to have an army that supports me. And so we felt that they knew the importance of it, and we felt the pressure, and so they had just started breaking the rules and making things happen. And I decided as a comptroller to continue with that. So I started buying things, writing blank checks, essentially. And this progressed. One of the things that kind of irked me was my general was a dress right general. General Eikenberry was I blame West Point for this, but I don't know. He's a West Point grad, very accomplished, 3-star general, and he wouldn't accept less standards on anything. And I think that's a mistake sometimes. I think sometimes you got to be able to accept an 80% solution so you can move on. But with the funding, he started telling me almost shortly after I arrived that he wanted to have me audited by CENTCOM. Now I'm writing blank checks. We don't have any money, and I'm protecting him. So I said, sir, you don't want to have, no, we don't want to have an audit. But he's dressed right general. He insists. So about 2 months in, I would have an audit team come out. but he kept insisting we get audited, and I was like, please don't do this to us. We are breaking the rules. And so this started causing me big time problems. So what I would do is, I would go out in the morning to buy things for the Army and return late at night. I would try to return before it got dark because it was dangerous out there. But I would go out in the morning, return at night, and I worked 18 to 20 hours a day easily. But at the end of my day, I would start writing down what I did wrong, what actions I'd taken, and sort of my justification, because I was certain either the auditors or an investigation was going to find it, and that I could go to jail and that kind of thing. And I was just like, there's extenuating and mitigating circumstances, and I'm just going to start recording this. So I just started doing that. So I went out by myself with an interpreter. I was one of the few people, if people were in theater from '02 to '03, they know there was a rule you had to go out with at least 3 vehicles, at least 2 had to have crew-served weapons up top. That was the theater rule. I was one of the very few exceptions. I would go out by myself with just an interpreter, with just my 9mm. And the reason being is because I had to have that flexibility because I was buying things for the Army. When we started getting money, I would go out with cash. So it wouldn't just be as dangerous as me and just an interpreter who had mace, but it would be $1 million or $2 million cash that I would be carrying around Afghanistan. And so it was these crazy situations that I was in. And the reason I was able to do that is because the ambassador gave me a waiver, because I had to. Nobody had a couple of gun vehicles to give me. I used an old Swedish up-armored vehicle that when the Swedes had evacuated, they left their vehicles behind, and one of them was like an up-armored Mercedes stick shift. And I would take that with the interpreter. I would drive, because interpreters, they couldn't drive. Our 2 interpreters couldn't drive. Most Afghanistans couldn't. And so I would drive and just go out on my own in these very dangerous, scary situations. And I never knew what I was getting into, and I would frequently get into things where I thought I might be a goner. One of the things that drove that home for me, that kind of affected me and probably affects me to this day, and maybe even made me a better innovator, but definitely affected me in a weird way, is that General Eikenberry, dressed right general, he wanted somebody to be in charge of these cats and dogs that were flowing into Kabul. Start of the war, you can imagine the confusion, the mayhem. There's units and people are assigned to them, but there were so many needs happening in Kabul for special type of troops, low density troops like psychological ops, military intelligence, communications. They were flowing in and they didn't report to anybody. And Eikenberry didn't like that. I'm busy as hell, but because I'm right there and he knows I can walk and chew gum, he assigned me to be their commander, their commandant. I don't know them from, right, they're all different service. I don't know from any. So this is another thing I pushed back on. I said, sir, I can't do this. I'm overwhelmed. I'm trying to manage tactical and strategic of all this. We need 100 comptrollers. I can't do it. He was like, no, Mick, you're doing it. In the Army, I lived on the 2-question rule. I ask once and I give my best argument. And if my boss comes back and tells me no again, and it's a lawful order, then I suck it up. I make it my mission and I try to do it. So he gave it to me and I became the commandant for about 1,000 people there running around in Kabul. Well, I'm based out of the embassy and I'm their commandant. And lo and behold, a couple of them get caught. They get captured. They get interrogated, brutally killed by the Taliban, and they film it and they send it to us because they want us to know. And they want everybody to know they're bad guys. They kill them in inhumane ways. I see that as a commandant. It comes to us at the embassy. And very sorry that happened. And I don't want that to ever happen anyways. But I personally, too, I'm out in the middle of those people every day. And now it hits home with me even more when I see those things that, oh, crud. Simonelli, Mick, you got a pipe dream thinking that your 9mm with 1 round is going to get you out of, well, with 2 magazines, I mean, is going to get you out of trouble. It's a pipe dream. You're not going to get out of trouble with that. And so I realize I'm going to have to myself. When I get into trouble, I'm going to have to, I can't rely on forcing them to me or thinking I'm going to be able to get out of trouble. I'm going to have to myself quickly. So that I always knew before I might have to, right? I carried a burqa with me and I was prepared in my mind kind of to shoot all my rounds and save one for me, or use the burqa to try to get away. Carry the burqa. You put it over, it covers you completely. I had all these fantasies about getting away. When I saw those videos, I was like, I need to face reality. Do you want to get caught and have this happen and have those tapes sent to your family? And I was like, hell no. So what I did then is I said, I got to resolve to myself. So every day when I would go out, I would rehearse myself. And I only physically rehearsed it a couple of times, but I actually timed myself. When I would go out frequently, I'd be in civilian clothes with a vest and I'd have my 9mm here. Sometimes I'd go out in desert BDUs and I'd have my 9mm here. So from both places, I rehearsed how long it took me. I kept my weapon off, safe. But from both cases, I rehearsed how long it took me to go and fire up here. I was going to use the method to shoot up in the roof of my mouth. And it only took me 3 to 5 seconds. And so I rehearsed that, and it hurts. If you quickly put your weapon in your mouth, the metal hits your lips or hits your teeth. And so I figured it took me maybe 5 seconds. I figured I could do it in 3, because when I was jammed up, I wasn't going to care about hurting my lips or teeth. But when I was in garrison practicing, so I practiced that. And then I would think about it. And occasionally while I was out, I would be in bad situations where I would think, oh crud, this is it. Because I didn't know, it wasn't a linear battlefield. I had this exception to be out on my own. I had bunches of money. I was very well known because I was the money guy. I was probably the 3rd most popular guy in Afghanistan. The ambassador, my boss, Eikenberry, and me, because I was a nobody. I was a major, but I was the money guy. And so when I would go into a place, I would notice people would come to me and they would know I was there and all that would happen. So I ran into these situations where I thought I was dead. In fact, I've got a photo. I have an actual photo I value it because it's a photo of a snapshot at this exact moment I thought I was a goner. I think I was buying furniture out at some remote outpost, and with my interpreter, there was a bad scene going on, and there was bustling, and my spidey sense was up, and my interpreter had recently had some serious threats given to him. He was always getting threats, but serious threats, and he was concerned. And so we were just in this bad mindset, and they rushed out right in front of me a goat, and they sliced the goat's neck with one of their big Afghanistan knives right in front of me, and just, I started bleeding and squirting blood. And I was like, okay, they're about to get me. This is it. Right at that moment, they brought up this old-fashioned camera, took a picture of me and some of the leaders there, around me. Turns out that they were celebrating my arrival, that we were going to eat the goat, and we were going to celebrate their sales of they were going to insist that I stay. They were going to celebrate the sale of their furniture and stuff to me. But at that exact moment, I thought I was a goner, and they took a picture. So I have this picture of me there going, oh crap, I'm a goner. I've got my weapon. And my interpreter thought we were gone too. He's like this with his hand in his nose going, oh no, we're dead. I think he's praying. We both thought we were goners, and I've got that photo. So it was a great photo, something I value. But I had moments like that where I just thought I was a goner, and it kind of affected me a little bit, in that when you think you're going to die, it changes your perception of things a lot. I was worried for our interpreters, because when you work with Americans, the Taliban was ruthless. They were ruthless, and they had no qualms about telling you and your family, you better not work with this or you were dead. This is one of the tools they used, and they used it very effectively. So our allies in Afghanistan were patriots. They were putting their lives on the line because they were living in the community with them. One of our interpreters, we had the two best interpreters in the country because we were at the embassy. One of our interpreters would actually just get free rides into work, just get in cars with anybody. And that's the one that was with me that day. And he was super worried. So working as the comptroller, I was essentially the comptroller for the Afghan Army. I always had this struggle between the strategic and the tactical. I really needed to focus on the strategic. If you think about, I needed to spend about to get that army started. This is just the start of the army. It would grow to about 350,000 over 20 years. But we were just starting it. We were building it from scratch, from nothing. And the reason being is that the powers that be, including my boss, had decided we can't trust the existing infrastructure. So we're going to build it from scratch. So we had this strategic outlook. So I needed to spend probably 400, I would end up spending 400 million during my time, but I looked at what I could spend realistically. I had to spend it in $1 million or more increments. Well, if you think about the logistics, right? Yeah, being over a year, you can't spend it in 20,000. It would be physically impossible for me to do 20,000 here, 20,000 there. I had to be spending large chunks of money to get this thing going. But my problem was I was the only comptroller. So, I mean, we should have had 100 guys. So I had tactical $20,000, $10,000 bills coming in, but I needed to spend millions. And some of the tactical things were really also draining. When I first got there, they expected me to make reparation pays. So we would accidentally, in training the Afghan forces, you know, we had ranges and stuff like that. We would accidentally people. And some of the worst victims were children. The Afghan Army in the early days when I was there would train on a range, and the Afghan people were poor. And some of these kids were so poor, I mean, they were poor like no shoes, no food poor. And so the brass that we fired was very valuable to collect. So they would rush out sometimes while the Afghanistan National Army was firing and collect the brass and get killed or maimed. It was a tragedy. They were doing it a lot. At the start, they wanted me to go make the payments. I didn't have an apparatus to do it, so I was going out and doing it. Those were less than $5,000 payments. We were paying nothing for it. Sometimes they were goats. Picking money to buy goats, but I had to go out and do that. In fact, one time the wing commander went with me, and he actually snapped a photo of there was deaths and there was injuries, and we had a special forces doctor working on the injured soldier, and the father's just glaring at me, just pissed off. So not only did I have to tactically do that and waste time, I had to spend in million increments and I was spending in thousands, but it was a very, very unsatisfying thing to go look at parents, brothers and sisters when their child's been killed or shot. And I had to go out and do that. So my solution was, this is again illegal, and I don't know any other way around this, but my solution was to just empower the special forces guys and make them what the Army called paying agents. And I would give them the money and give them the freedom to go buy the goats, pay them off, and do things like that. I had the same problem with pay that I solved that way. So the Afghanistan soldiers had to get paid. We were paying them, I think at that time, about $120 a month. And somebody had to do it. They didn't have their own apparatus to pay it. They didn't have their own money. They didn't have any finance. Right? We're building it from scratch. So they expected me to do it. And I was like, guys, it's mission impossible. I can't do it. So what I did is I made the special forces, again, who were training them at payday, I made them paying agents, and I would give them each 50,000. I had like 30 paying agents. So I'd give 30 special forces 50,000 each. That's $1.5 million. and then they would take care of it. And it was unauthorized. It was against regulations. It was illegal. It was the only way to do it. And we had great comms at the embassy, so I would get to talk with the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the comptrollers and with CENTCOM and the planners there at CENTCOM too, the ones who I'd met, who were good guys, but they weren't in touch with the reality of the ground. So I suggested to them, I said, look, just let me take the pay. Let me give it to they're starting their version of a Treasury Department. Let me give it to them and let's let them take care of the pay. That'll give them some structure. I said, but let me just tell you, they're going to lose 10 to 20% right off the top. 10 to 20% is going to be gone in what they call baksheesh. That was their term, the Dari Persian term for it. That's when you get money, you're in charge, and you skim some off the top. It's just part of their business practices. And when I told OSD and CENTCOM that, they were vehemently opposed to giving money to the Afghans. They were like, nope, there ain't no way. You keep doing it, Simonelli. And I was like, I can't do it physically. There's not enough for me to go on. I said, well, you're not going to give it to them. We can't justify losing that kind of money. So that's why I made the Special Forces guys paying agents. And I know there was a lot of opportunity for fraud there, right? Because now I've got 30 guys with 50,000 each. I'm managing millions. And I would be remiss if I acted like I wasn't tempted. So I was even tempted. When I was in Bosnia, when we cleared bad guy checkpoints and they would drop their weapons, we would end up with a bunch of, AK-47s and other types of weapons. And at that mission, they had me bury them. A couple of times we just had engineers dig a big hole and we buried them because we didn't have anything to do with them. And I was thinking about that in Afghanistan as I was driving around with $1 million or $2 million, just me and my interpreter. And I was like, I could pick a spot, get a 10-digit grid to it, dig a hole, and drop $1 million or $2 million. And, I didn't. Luckily, my integrity held out, but I thought about it. No, I'm sorry I thought about it, but I did. And so when I was giving cash money to these other people, I'm sure one of the reasons the DOD doesn't want that is because it's open for tons of fraud, theft, pilferage. But what could I do? So every month I was given about $1.5 million, and it would increase over time to the Special Forces guys to pay the troops. Yeah. And by the way, I do have a little bit of money now, but it's my money. I never went back to Afghanistan. The evidence is I've never gone back to Afghanistan. I would have had to go to Afghanistan to claim that if I'd done it. I did not take any money, thank goodness. I was so anxious. I got used to it, but it was every day. I'm an innovator, and it made me on a positive note, it made me I was willing to die for that mission. And nowadays, as a consultant innovator, I'm willing to die in the sense of I'm not afraid to tell CEOs, board members, whoever, that they're enforcing the status quo, that they're not being genuine with their efforts. I give up lots of jobs when I get a sense from the bosses that they're not willing to really change. And so in that respect, nothing now will ever challenge me like that did, and it makes me a better innovator today in a weird way. Two of the early lessons that we had with how Afghanistan business operations work were with the WAS vehicles and the Chinese uniforms. So for the Chinese uniforms, early on I mentioned we didn't have tons of money. And so we also took donations for the Army. And one of the things we got donated was 50,000 Chinese uniforms early on. The Chinese government donated 50,000. We were getting donations from everywhere, and it was very awesome. Everybody pitched in this effort. The French, the Brits, the Japanese, Canadians, everybody was there. And so it was an awesome joint effort. But in this case, the Chinese contributed 50,000 uniforms. And the logistics guy and I thought it was just simple enough. We gave it to the existing Ministry of Defense and said, can you please distribute this to our new soldiers? Thinking that's what would happen. And instead, none of them got there. What we saw is like the next couple of days, we started seeing trickles of the exact Chinese uniforms. They're very identifiable, the BDU pattern, etc. We started seeing them around Kabul. And then a week later, we started seeing more of them. They were just being worn by people around, just normal people around Kabul. And then 2 weeks, we saw bunches. The logistics officer went back and said, "What?" And none of them made it to the Afghan National Army. So logistics officer, Lieutenant Colonel, went back to them. He was on our OMC team. He went back to the Ministry of Defense. Said, "What happened to them?" He said, "Well, I distributed them." He's like, "But then none of them got to the soldiers." Like, "Well, what could I do?" He said, "I took, whatever, 10% of them and gave it to, but then I gave it to so-and-so, my cousin, who's the general below me. And, he was supposed to distribute them. But what had happened is he took his 10%, he gave it, and by the time it was supposed to get to where it was, none were there. And this is the way their business operations worked. This is their ethics. And it's something we have to deal with. This is just the way, it's not just in that portion of the country in Afghanistan, but also the Russians had been there for 20 years, right? The Soviets and then the Russians themselves, when they stopped being the Soviet Union, they had also taught them their own brand of corruption and bureaucracy. And so the Afghans this is the way they thought things worked. And at each level, what used to frustrate the hell out of me with their bureaucracy, I hate bureaucracy as an innovator. I think it gets in the way of launching things and transforming. But they used to have so many approval levels at every step, and everybody had a stamp. Something about stamps were magical to them. At each level, somebody would take their percentage, and they'd put their stamp on it. And when I would try to, in the early days when I was trying to sort of buy things without money, they always wanted my stamp because it mattered that much to them. So what I did is I went back to just to make it easy, I went back to the embassy and I found an old stamp and I configured it. You could take the rubber out and put things in, and I made my own little stamp, and then I had it, and that worked for them. And I would stamp things, I would make promises to buy stuff, and if I stamped some document for them, they would be happy and accept it. And so this is one of my problems, though. I was buying things. A comptroller needs contracts in place. They need other things in place. You need the right color money. I didn't have any of that, and I was buying everything, and this was a real danger. And so I mentioned that Eikenberry wanted the audit, and they eventually came. About halfway through my tour, the auditors came out from CENTCOM. And my prayers were answered, though, because they were so afraid of the day they were only there for 2 days. The day they got to the embassy, they were civilians. They had they'd issued them the battle rattle to protect them, but they were scared. The day they got there, we had a rocket attack at the embassy, and they stayed hidden in a bunker for the next 4 hours. So then they came out the next day, and we had somebody come up to our gate at the embassy and fire rounds, and that scared them, and they were back down in the bunker. And I offered to take them out, and they were like, "Oh, we don't want to go out with you." And so they developed this massive respect for what we were doing out there, and they were afraid, and they barely got to look at my books. And so their 2-day audit turned into a nothing burger. They found nothing, and if they did, they pushed it aside because they didn't look at anything. But if they did see anything, they pushed it aside and said, "Well, we're going to give them a break because that's a dangerous place." And so I cleared the audit, and it was great for me. Yeah. The WAS vehicles were a different story. The WAS vehicles were purchased from Russia. And they were purchased by the logistics officer. So I had asked General Eikenberry, they wanted me to make all the money decisions when I showed up as comptroller. I was like, "I can't make those decisions. Can you please tag the logistics officer to make the logistics decisions, the engineer to make the engineer decisions, the operations guy, the infantry guy to make because they were on the staff." I said, "I can execute, and that's too much of a job for me, but I don't know anything about engineering, anything about logistics." And he's like, "Yeah." So I then got them to make the decisions, and I would execute more in a money fashion. For the vehicles, I did get a little involved because we were going to spend so much money on vehicles for this new army. We're building them from scratch, and none of them could drive. None of the Afghan soldiers could drive anyways. There were no vehicles. So we were going to create an entire industry in this country. But the logistics guy had decided to buy Russian WAS vehicles. They were called a WAS. They were a horrible vehicle. They look like small Jeeps, but they didn't perform like them. They were the worst vehicles in the world. Russians make a horrible vehicle, in my opinion, and the Wazas were particularly bad. So the first 1,000 that he bought before I came were coming down right as I showed up, and they were driving them down from Russia. And I think it was 1,000. And on the way, we lost more than 50% of them, just broke down on the side of the road. And they had no way to get them either. I don't know whatever happened, but so they got less than 50% of the Wazas. Then when the Wazas were there, they performed horribly. They broke down everywhere they went. The axles fell off. They had wheel problems like crazy. They couldn't start. They were just a horrible vehicle. So as the comptroller, I was like, okay, we're going to spend. I saw us building for the first 6 battalions, conducts we call them. I saw us, buying, a couple thousand trucks, and then I could see the forecast of the Army. Right, it would end up being 350,000 strong, way after my time. But whatever vehicle we bought was going to be used. It was going to create a foothold in the country. It was going to be used. You're going to need maintenance bays. You're going to need people to learn how to drive them. You're going to have association for these Afghan soldiers who've never driven a vehicle, and now they're driving their first vehicle. And what do we want it to be? And I thought it should be an American vehicle, because I was like, crud, we're spending millions and millions, billions, and ultimately trillions of American dollars. Let's make it an American company. So I suggested, Ford or Chevy or somebody like that. And I tried to, from Afghanistan, I didn't have any success, but I tried to get a hold of them, and I couldn't. And I tried to go through contractors, and I couldn't. And General Eikenberry, my boss, was friends with Dov Zakheim. He was the comptroller of the entire OSD at the time. He came out to visit us, and we talked to him about it. And he was able to get a hold of Ford. And Ford, we made Ford, because of that, the official supplier. Ford Rangers became the vehicle for the Afghan Army. So I kind of interjected to try to get an American vehicle, and Zakheim helped. I don't know if they're still using them or not, but they were way better than the Wazas anyways, and they were way more efficient. And now, unfortunately, the Taliban has them all. So maybe it would have been better if we left the Wazas with them. But that was the Waz story, and there was lessons learned for us about Russian equipment and what we do. One of the tactical areas that I had to manage was, and I didn't want to, I wanted to get rid of it. That's why we tried to create experts that could help with that. But one of the bills that I kept seeing when I first arrived, as we were building them billets, was plumbing problems, toilet seats, and windows broken. And I would have to take time and energy. I don't want to sound like a spoiled comptroller, but I would have to take time and energy and write checks for $10,000, $20,000, which I just could not do. So I was wondering, what the heck is wrong? What's going on that's causing toilet seats and plumbing and windows? And so the engineer had been, agreed to help me in the office. And so he went out to find out. And what he found out was kind of a sign of the cultural differences between the Afghanistan way of life and the West way of life. And it turns out, so we built them these nice new, or we'd refurbished barracks for them. And we'd made them to Western standards. New toilets, nice windows, good plumbing. And we trained them too, right? The special ops guys that trained them. But the cultures were so different, the ways of life were so different, that what they were doing was causing these bills. So what was behind the broken windows was simply that Afghanistan, if you looked at the countryside when I was there, had no windows. All windows were broken out from war. 20 years of war with the Soviets and the Russians had taken out all the windows, and there were no roofs on most of the places. So they were in the habit of starting fires in their places, right? They would have barbecues essentially in their huts, in their homes, and they just naturally wanted to continue that in our billets. So they would start fires, but they were the fires and the smoke would be contained because of the dumb windows. So they would just bust the windows, say, oh, that's stupid. Got the stupid window, we don't need it. They would break them out. So that was behind the windows. The toilet seats was because we had given them nice Western toilet seats, but that was ethnocentric of us to do that, because they did not go to the bathroom that way. They went to the bathroom Asian style, where you squat over a hole. It's more healthier for you, they say. But we had built them state-of-the-art toilet seats with beveled seats on it. So what they were doing is standing on the toilet and squatting. and going to the bathroom. But the toilet seats were rounded and they were hard to stand on. So they were worthless to them. So they would tear them off and get rid of them so they could stand on the flat part of the toilet under the toilet seat. And that's why I kept getting bills for those, because we'd put them on and they'd tear them off. And then lastly, the plumbing was related to bathroom problems too. And it was because during that history of 20 years of war, they didn't use toilet paper, or at least these soldiers were not in the habit of using toilet paper. In fact, they didn't prefer it. What they used was smooth rocks. So Afghanistan has a bunch of rocks and there's a bunch of smooth rocks. I'm not knocking this method, I've never tried it, but they found it better to wipe their rear ends with smooth rocks. So they were doing like they were trained. They were going to the bathroom, wiping their rear ends, putting the smooth rock in the toilet and flushing it. And that was clogging up our plumbing system. And so those 3 bills, you know, I was glad to find out what was wrong, and we were able to fix it by building them the correct, you know, the engineer then built them the correct places to go to the bathroom and understood they needed a place to burn and all that. But for me, it was good to get those off my plate and get somebody else to solve it and to stop doing tactical things with my time, because we were building an army from scratch and it was just rough. But that was an indicator of how culturally different we were. It's such a cultural difference that you won't see any service members coming back that came back from Afghanistan with Afghanistan wives. Do you notice that? You won't see any. It's not like we're in Korea, someplace like that, where we have cultural differences, but there's still some things so similar that they could come together. We're so different in our cultures that you're not seeing any of that, because we're just too far apart. And you could see that in our operations, in the way we funded things and the way we built things, you know, and that's a classic example. We didn't need to build state-of-the-art toilets. We needed to build some nice holes for them. They started building outhouses and the ones that were already existing, they built them nice outhouses outside with the kind of facilities they want. And for the burning of things, they showed them how to use outdoor pits, you know, asked them not to burn stuff inside the houses anymore. Another thing that you know, a very different cultural thing is this phrase, inshallah, God's will. And I think this impacts their operations, and that is that the Afghanistan people have a firm belief in God, their God, which you know, I'm not knocking. Inshallah means God's will. And they would do it to an extreme that caused them not to prepare for anything. So I actually witnessed a Kondak, one of our trained battalions, get a mission. The mission was to go out and do something, and our Special Forces trainers were there, you know, to oversee it. And the Special Forces trainers had taught the battalion commander and his subordinate commanders to give a warning order and to go through the necessary troop leading process. Well, they gave the Kondak commander, the battalion commander, the mission, and the next day they were supposed to show up. Well, the next day at the formation where the you know, the battalion was supposed to show up, only the battalion commander showed up. The trainer was like, "Where's everybody?" He was like, "Inshallah." He was like, "What do you mean, inshallah? We gave you the mission yesterday. Did you give the warning order? You know, did you get initiate necessary troop movement?" He was like, "No." And he's like, "Why?" He's like, "Inshallah. If God had wanted it to happen, it would happen." And he truly believed that without telling his troops to get ready, where they were going, how they were going, he truly believed it, how they were going to get there, that they would know. And if they didn't, then it was God's will, they shouldn't go. That God's will thought was everywhere. During the early days when I was there, 02, 03, as our vehicles started rolling in, we were hitting people on the roadside by mistake, running over them. And it was because they had this weird God's will approach to crossing the street. Instead of looking both ways or stopping for a truck when this truck was speeding by, they would just keep walking. And if they got hit, they would say God's will. It was a crazy way of thinking in my mind, even our best interpreter. So I was eating lunch with him once just in the little embassy compound, and he knocked over his milk. And I said, "Oh, you knocked over your milk. Let me help you to clean him up." And he was like, or his water or whatever it was. And he was like, "No, I didn't knock it over. It just knocked over. It was God's will." I said, "No, you Nassim, you hit it with your hand." And he was like, and this guy was a pediatrician, you know, in real life, and had become an interpreter to help us. And he's an educated guy. He was like, "No, after that point, we've debated a little bit, and I would use St. Thomas Aquinas, Western guy's quote, and who said, yes, pray like it depends on God, but work like it depends on you. And I would try to introduce that to him. I'd say, you got to work like it. You got to recognize that you're doing things too. And he'd be like, no, it's all God. It's all God, Mick. So very different cultural norms. With regards to the strategic impact of Afghanistan and what happened, it was a huge tragedy. And when you look at it, you look at the arms of our sort of strategic influence. There's diplomatic, there's information, there's military, and there's economic. We were only the military, and we failed, and it was a huge failure. But I got to see the economic impact, and there's no reason we shouldn't have done something better economically. The Afghanistan people were ready for change. They were ready to embrace capitalism. The year I was there, I talked to the person at the Afghanistan government who managed new company applications. They had a process you had to do. He told me there were more new company applications in the year I was there than the 20 years prior. And that was an indication of how hungry they were to grow. Around Kabul, where I mostly operated, every single plot of land while I was there, somebody took control of it and was growing something. Shops sprang up everywhere. People wanted to learn about computers so badly. There was this hunger, this desire for capitalism and to grow and to make their lives better. And we failed in helping to develop that. What did we do? We turned Afghanistan strategically into a self-licking ice cream cone. We brought in the same government contractors, the same tired programs, and we started funding ourselves and not really helping the Afghanistan people. There's a number of people that got rich from Afghanistan from the trillions of dollars we spent and were helped greatly, but it wasn't the right people. We failed in that respect. There's an Italian saying that if you follow the money and you will find the mafia. And if you look at Afghanistan strategically, I think some of that's true. I think that our military industrial complex, I think they made a killing. And in the end, the military tenet, no man left behind, we violated that drastically. We left not just our people, not just our allies, but our Afghan friends who put their necks on the line in a very bad position. Many of them are probably dead now. Many of them had to go underground. We took victory laps after I was there. Oh, we're liberating the country. Oh, women can get educated now. Oh, that's BS, because we abandoned them. We didn't have to leave the way we did. There's a Chinese saying that success has many parents, and I think it's true. But I also think that the opposite's true. Failure is an orphan, because I'm an innovator and I see failure all the time, and nobody wants to take any responsibility for this failure. The White House publishes the paper saying we did nothing wrong, and this administration or that administration did it. Everybody's this. The bottom line is we deserted our friends and allies and people that we made a commitment to. And we should be deeply ashamed as Americans for that. I think the hasty pullout was a tragedy. I think it happened because there were political things at work that I don't understand that made people want to pull out. But I think we lost our moral bearings as a country when we did that. We had made a commitment. Personally, I certainly think we should not have been there for over 20 years. I think we should have been 3 or 4. We should have had an exit strategy. We should have used those 4 arms, diplomatic, information, military, economic, to help them support themselves and been gone. But when we left, after 20 years and trillions of dollars spent, we sure should have done it in a better manner. We sure should have been watching the situation unfold and seeing that as the Taliban was encroaching faster and faster, that we couldn't stick on the plan. They had a plan, but our army flopped too early. And we should have recognized that and at least had U.S. troops hold key places. To let Kabul fall was tragedy. It's hard to hold some of those remote places in Afghanistan. I don't know if you've been there, but they're tough to hold. There's an ancient saying in Afghanistan that the king only rules in Kabul. That's because over the years, nobody's been able to hold those thousands of years, those outland areas have been held by different people. But Kabul, you should have been able to hold. And we weren't, and we didn't help our allies hold it. We didn't help the Afghanistan people hold it. And I just think it was a tragedy the way we left. The images of people clinging to planes and trying to get away. The Afghanistan American Chamber of Commerce contacted me while that was all going on here in the States. And I guess because of my book that I'd written a long time ago, but they liked it and they wanted to buy some copies and to talk to me about it. And so I chatted with them about it, and they were at their wits' end about what was going on. They were trying to organize, their own back channel support to get more Afghan people out of there who were in trouble. And it was just a sign of how poorly we left the country. We really left it poorly. So how do you make sense of that? So how does a veteran, somebody who gave their all, went there, blood, sweat, tears, lost friends, family, how do you make sense of all that? And it's tough. It's tough. Looking through the lens of time, it's hard to make sense of that because it all seems like it was for nothing. You can probably say you did the honorable thing by supporting your country, but we certainly weren't successful in Afghanistan. In my mind, it's probably up there as the biggest failure of the United States next to Vietnam. 20 years of war, the longest war in technical war in U.S. history, and we flopped. We flopped at the end. And, what do you say to the Pat Tillmans of the world, the people who, they're real patriots, and they said, we want to go do something. If Pat Tillman and people like him had the foresight to see how we would finish, would they really want to go? So leaving Afghanistan, I was welcomed back to my community. While I was gone, I had left my two sons in the good hands of a special forces guy who ran a martial arts school, and he said he would keep an eye out for them. And so he had, they had gotten really good at martial arts while I was gone, and he had watched them, and I was grateful for that. I then went on to do more transformation stuff. Army was nice to me. I got promoted below the zone, which is ahead of my peers, to lieutenant colonel. One of my assignments as a comptroller was to become a deployment director for Army transformation again. And so the Army was trying a new business transformation thing, and I got to be in charge of it for 5th Army and Army North. And that gave me a hammer to start trying to make change, and I did. And I loved it. But again, I ran in, for me, the status quo was pretty powerful. I had good generals, and we tried to implement some things, but this is where I got the nickname Innovation Troublemaker. It was while I was lieutenant colonel in the Army, because I would make these changes. Part of it was we were supposed to use lean processes and Six Sigma. So the Army was into lean, everybody was at that time. So they gave me a master black belt. I became a black belt in Six Sigma and lean processes. But I did far more than that. I would dive into the defense travel card. I would, look at our funding processes. I would look at what way we were spending money, and I would make changes, because I was like, we need to make some changes, because there's plenty of room for that in the Army. The Army is so bureaucratic, so messed up in our processes, that they haven't even been able to get a clean audit last 40 years. So since when I was in, they couldn't get a clean audit. That means somebody look at their books and be able to tick and tie where everything goes and how it goes, to now they still haven't been able to. And that's just inexcusable. And the reason for that is because they use archaic planning systems that are so bureaucratic and so out of whack, called the programming, planning, budgeting system. So I was taking shots at that. This was started by, the system they're using was implemented in the 60s by the Defense Secretary McNamara and his whiz kids. That's how old and archaic it is. It's bureaucratic, it lacks agility, it lacks flexibility, and there's so many ways they could improve it now, but they just don't. So anyways, I was given a hammer, and I was starting to do things like that. I would get in trouble for it. And so the senior comptroller at the Pentagon, he's a 3-star, he was a status quo guy, and periodically I would get in trouble. I was lucky. My friend worked as his executive officer, and my classmate from Syracuse, and she would call me and give me heads up so I could run to my general before he called my general. And she, about every 3 months or so, she would call me and say, "Okay, Mick, I got to fill you in. Here's what's going on." I had to unglue General, we'll say his name, off the ceiling because you did this, because you're implementing this, because of this. And so I would say, yeah, but this is why. And she would understand because she was my friend and she got it. But I was just trying to make change. But it would give me an opportunity to run into my general and say, sir, let me give you a heads up. Remember we did this and this and this, and we're trying to implement this? Well, there's trouble in Pentagon, you might get a call. And so she would help me. But it didn't make my life easy. And it showed me that I wasn't, I was always going to fight the status quo. I was always fighting status quo. So as a lieutenant colonel, but the Army still liked me. And they then offered me, at my 17th or 18th year of service, they then offered me the War College, which is this premier next step. I was a lieutenant colonel, I'd be a colonel after that. And they did it below the zone again, ahead of my peers. I had options then, and I was talking to the CEO at USAA. The CEO at USAA was a retired general, and lo and behold, he had been the budget officer in the Army when we digitized, and I was a transformation officer. So I had a little bit of knowledge and work with him. He was a big shot though, and I was a little shot, but he was now the CEO at USA, and he didn't have an innovation program or anything. And I was talking to him, he was like, Mick, there's money in the ceilings and the walls, it's around the corner, but there's opportunity here. And I had an opportunity to go work there. And when I found out, so I wouldn't have to move, go to the War College and then probably the Pentagon. My family didn't have to move. But then when I heard the pay, which was a multiple of what I was making in the Army, it was kind of a no-brainer for me. So the Army offered me this War College and they forced my hand and I said no, and I retired. And it was another one of those kind of innovation moments where my general counseled me. It was like, no, you don't understand, Mick. You don't turn down, you shouldn't have turned down the Ranger School. Forget about that. You don't turn down the War College. You don't turn down the next rank. And I was like, oh, I got to, it's time for me to go. So that's why I said I was in the Army for 20 years and 5 seconds, because, they forced my hand, and right at 20 years, I was like, okay, I'm going to go to the private sector. I became an innovator at USA. I became in charge. I built their program eventually, their first program, thanks to General Robles and the executive team there. And they had huge success. So for 6 years, and we broke all kinds of records. General Robles was right. There was money in the ceilings and the walls everywhere. We broke all kinds of records for innovation. I got a good reputation. His legacy, General Robles' legacy, became the innovation CEO, which was great for him. And my reputation became good enough that when I left USAA, I just put up a shingle, for hire, and people saw what we were doing there, and they were like, that guy's got experience and knowledge, and they would hire me. And I've since worked for 5 of the top 10 insurance companies in the US, a number of top banks. I've been like I said, I just finished a stint with the Union of Arab Banks. That's 320 banks in 21 countries in the Middle East. And so I do that kind of thing now as a hired gun. And if people want true experience and knowledge and the ability to get things done in the digital or transformation space, sometimes they look for me and I take it on. And I'm grateful to the Army, where they gave me the skills and the ability and things like the Afghan National Army to hone my skills and to learn how to do that. So the failure in Afghanistan is many people's failures, but it's my biggest failure. And I've had a lot of big failures. So as an innovator, you can count on failing a lot. What you want to do is you want to fail fast and cheap. My business life, that's always how I set things up. Experiments, tests and learns, fail fast, fail cheaply, you learn. One of 3 things happens from a new idea. It's either a total stinker and you kill it, or it's halfway decent and got other things wrong and you try to improve it. That's where most ideas fall. Or it's completely great and you drive on with it. Well, most things fall in the middle. So you have to test and learn real quick and then decide what, there's the word pivots, but you have to decide where you want to go with that and shape your idea. We didn't do that in Afghanistan. We invested trillions. And what's more important is people's lives, and we failed, and we failed in such a horrible way. It's just a a splotch mark on the record in the history of the United States. And I think it's a tragedy. So for me personally, I'm embarrassed about the book I wrote. It's so old now, riding a donkey backwards through Afghanistan. Because I mentioned that I had recorded all of those things that I did wrong. Well, when I was done, I took them with me because I didn't know if I would be audited or whatever. I wasn't, but I realized I had a book, and I thought it was a Comptroller book. So I was fortunate enough to get somebody to help me, McBride Literary. They looked at what I wrote and they were like, "No, this is I wrote about Comptroller stuff that was pretty boring." And they threw that away. They said, "No, it's these special interest stories. It's about these things that your book's you needs to be." And so they threw out all the Comptroller stuff and they made it riding a donkey backwards. How to transform the Afghan National Army is about personal interest stories. And they helped me write a pretty good book. I won awards. Even the Army gave me an award for it. I learned the term infantry comes from infant, meaning baby, meaning not in control. And in a very real sense, we were all so many service members, myself included, we were infants. I'm not infantry, but we were cogs in the wheel of this big thing that happened. And so many people went there with good intentions, trying to do good things. And in the end, it was a bad thing. And I'm very sad about that personally, but I don't know what we can do about it. It was a big failure. We failed in absolutely the wrong way and absolutely should probably have never done it that way, but it's too late now. It's over. And now we just have to collect the pieces, let it go and move on. Afghanistan was arguably the biggest failure in American history. The Afghan National Army was probably the biggest part of that. We built it from scratch, and I was there at the start, and so I own a piece of that failure, and I feel sorry for that. And I feel sorry for the veterans who participated, but they went there, they did their best, and they tried. Probably the biggest thing I'm concerned about is what the Afghanistan American Chamber of Commerce told me about, and that was they thought that there were hundreds of thousands of American supporters there whose lives were still in danger, who weren't taken out of the country, who weren't evacuated. What's going on with them now? We made a promise. We have a saying, "No man left behind." Well, we left, if they're right, hundreds of thousands of people behind. Are they dead? Are they injured? And for that, I'm very sorry. And I'm sorry I was part of it.